On June 5, 2005, in Memphis, Tennessee, a 39-year-old mother was discovered in her bedroom with countless stab wounds and a wicker basket covering her head. The investigation would lead the police to a very unusual suspect and result in a conviction that some claim was an injustice. Who was this victim, and who was the monster who had brutally murdered her inside her home? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Early Sunday morning around 5 a.m. in Memphis, Tennessee, Josiah Koch and his wife were abruptly awakened by a loud banging at their door. They were met with an unexpected but known visitor. It was Noura Jackson, their teen neighbor from across the street. She was in a panic, yelling, my mom, somebody's breaking into my house." Mr. Koch grabbed his pistol and returned with Noura to the Jackson residence. Meanwhile, Mrs. Koch called 911 about the incident. Once inside the house, Noura ran to the back and also called 911. When Josiah Koch asked Noura where her mother was, through hysterical tears she told him she was in the bedroom. The woman was lying on the floor between the end of the bed and the wall. She was nude and covered in blood. Her bed was also sprayed with blood. Mr. Koch ran back to his residence, screaming to his wife that Mrs. Jackson had been murdered. They both returned to the Jacksons' residence, where they found Noura in the sunroom. She was rocking and wailing, curled up on the floor, holding the phone in her lap. Mrs. Koch gently took the phone from the girl and spoke to the 911 operator. Josiah Koch noticed that Noura's vehicle, a Jeep Cherokee, was parked in the driveway. The weekend before the murder, Ms. Jackson and her daughter had asked him to keep an eye out on their house while they were out of town. He witnessed between 20 to 40 teenagers venture into their backyard with beer. He contacted the police to check on the residence, but at the time, no one answered the door, and they were unable to open the backyard gate. The police watched the teens flee the scene, jumping over the fence and across the street. Once the police left, the teenagers returned, but only for a little while longer. Per instructions by the 911 dispatcher, Mrs. Koch went inside the victim's room to perform CPR, but upon entering the bedroom and seeing the bloody state she was in, she knew that it was already too late. The woman was motionless, and her expression was fixed. Mrs. Koch returned to the phone and told the 911 operator that the victim appeared to be deceased, and for quite some time. She told them that she saw bloody footprints in the hallway that led to Ms. Jackson's bedroom. Around 5:15 a.m., Officer Russell Tinkersley of the Memphis Police Department first arrived at the scene of what was claimed to be a home burglary. Upon entry to the Jackson residence, he observed blood in the hallway. In the doorway of the victim's bedroom was a pool of blood. The bed was also covered in blood. The woman was lying on the floor at the foot of the bed. At that moment, her daughter Noura rushed into the house screaming, my mom! He requested that one of the other officers take the hysterical young woman outside. Officer Tinkersley noted that although it was abnormally hot and humid that morning, around 90 to 95 degrees already, the daughter wore a sweatshirt or fleece-type jacket. The officer observed a set of shoe prints on the bloodied kitchen floor. The window that led to the kitchen door from the garage was broken, and there was shattered glass on the floor. Michelle Halbert, a firefighter and paramedic, along with 4 other firefighters, responded to the call. She discovered the victim nude on the floor. The woman had multiple stab wounds to her chest, neck, and head. Strangely, her body, in particular her head, neck, and upper chest region, was partially covered with a wicker basket. Her mouth was oozing with blood, and she was no longer breathing. The woman's heart was also confirmed to have stopped beating. The victim's body felt cool to the touch, but at the time she didn't take the core temperature. Ms. Jackson was pronounced officially deceased at 5:18 a.m. Meanwhile, officers sat with the victim's teenage daughter outside, wanting to make sure she was all right, and trying to figure out who could have been behind this grisly scene. Noura Jackson told investigators about Mark Irvin, her mother's on-again, off-again boyfriend. The couple had heated arguments, but it had never escalated to anything physical, much less abusive or violent. At the time of her mother's murder, they had been separated. Noura told them that her mother's boyfriend was an asshole, but he wouldn't do something like this. The police officer observed that the girl was strangely calm. She didn't appear to be in shock and wasn't overly emotional. She was also dressed oddly, wearing a large, long-sleeved gray sweatshirt and a denim skirt with tennis shoes. It had been an extremely hot and humid June morning, already around 90 degrees. A crime scene investigator with the Memphis police, Officer David Payment, arrived at the residence around 5:45 a.m. His first process was to walk the perimeter of the home. He noticed there were multiple vehicles in the driveway. Blood appeared to be on the front door and the porch. When he entered the victim's bedroom, Officer Payment was taken aback by the disturbing sight. The woman was lying deceased on the floor, her body blood-soaked from what appeared to be multiple stab wounds. On the upper left corner of the bottom sheet, there was what appeared to be a bloody shoe print. One of the pillows had multiple patterns of blood. There were smears, possible pooling, and blood spatter. Within the victim's hands were 2 long, blonde strands of hair. Based on the log, 22 individuals entered the crime scene from the time Officer Payment arrived at 5:45 a.m. until he left the residence at 3 p.m. Officer Payment, along with Officers Davison and Turnmeyer, worked the homicide scene. Davison was responsible for taking photographs. Upon arrival, Officer Davison noticed that there were no signs of forced entry into the residence and all doors and windows were locked. Thomas Heldorfer, lead homicide investigator, was in charge of the crime scene. Upon arrival, he observed what appeared to be blood on the front porch and door. When he entered the residence, he observed blood in the kitchen, hallway bathroom, in the foyer, and the victim's bedroom. The tub, shower, and sink of the hallway bathroom were also wet. There appeared to be droplets of blood on the floor. During the investigation, 810 photographs, in addition to a videotape, were made. The video recording of the house, which was an uncommon police procedure to gather evidence, was done in an attempt to show what they considered to be an unusual scene. The Jackson residence had so many things inside that some rooms were relatively put together, where others were a chaotic mess. Jennifer Jackson's family later referred to her as a pack rat. In addition to images of the victim's body, several pictures were captured of a knife next to the sink, another knife and a golf club on a countertop, and a knife block which showed 2 empty slots. None of the knives were processed for fingerprints, although some photographs indicated an impression left behind on the dirt in front of the gate that led to the backyard. No casts or lifts were taken. The house was thoroughly tested for fingerprints, but none were complete enough to be identifiable. Shoe prints were lifted from the hallway. One of the photographs showed what looked like a broken wooden crate lodged underneath the bed. Evidence and areas of the residence were sprayed with a chemical product that was new to the department. Hungarian red, or Kumasi blue, is a chemical that clings to biological fluid, in this case, possible blood samples. So it can be photographed and applied with a gel lift to preserve as evidence. Besides the bed mattress, comforter, sheets, and pillows, multiple items were gathered for evidence. Several items at the crime scene were sprayed, including a pair of shoes, the wicker basket, a wooden footstool, and a light switch cover from the bedroom. There was also an envelope that contained a piece of blue plastic and a piece of an envelope that held possible hair, in addition to a condom wrapper found next to the victim's bed on the floor. The closet doors were sprayed, as well as broken pieces of glass from the kitchen and a silver-colored knife. Upon returning to the victim's house, Sergeant William D. Merritt located additional condoms inside a table in the victim's bedroom and in a box in the daughter's room. Sergeant Merritt neglected to submit the found condom wrapper for DNA analysis since it had a plastic-type surface, and instead opted to have it tested for fingerprint analysis since the database was more expensive. Sergeant Connie Justice of the Memphis Police Department Homicide Unit transported the daughter Noura Jackson to the homicide office to obtain a witness statement. Noura Jackson rode in the front seat of her unmarked police cruiser. The young woman passed out for about 14 minutes, which was the total duration of the drive. Sergeant Justice had to shake the teenage girl awake when they arrived. According to Noura Jackson, on the night before the incident occurred, she had attended the Italian festival, then went to her friend Carter Kobach's house, a party in Germantown, and then ended the evening at her friend Perry Brasfield's. While at Perry's place, she had called her mother at 12:10 a.m. Noura hung out at Perry Brasfield's for about a half hour longer, and then her three friends, Richard, Sophia, and Brooke, drove her back to her own vehicle. Noura headed to the convenience store to purchase cigarettes and then pick up something to eat at Taco Bell, but then she suddenly realized she didn't have her wallet. She called Perry and asked him to check his house for it. Noura next drove back to Carter's house, where she found her wallet. Then she purchased gas and headed to Eric Whitaker's residence in Cordova. She spoke with her friend Andrew Hammock, who said he wanted to come see her kitten at her house. But when Noura returned home, she never got a chance to call Andrew. It was somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m. Noura claimed to have entered her home through the front door with her key. She walked into the kitchen to get her kitten when she stepped on something that cracked. There was shattered glass all over the kitchen floor. Noura said she recalled turning on the hallway light, but she couldn't remember whether or not she turned on the light in her mother's bedroom. She saw that the bathroom light inside her mother's bedroom was on, and the door was open. Noura found this peculiar since her mother usually kept the door closed when she slept. She said she was the only person in the house. When Noura went to her mother's bedroom, she saw her on the floor with the wicker basket on her head. She pulled it off and attempted to talk to her, but her mother said nothing. Noura checked her pulse and shook her over and over again, but still, there was no response. That's when Noura ran over to her neighbors for help. She said that she touched her mother's face and arms when she discovered her body. She wiped off the blood from her hands with some towels in the sunroom. There was also blood on her tennis shoes, both of which were collected for evidence. When the police inquired about anything valuable that someone may have taken from her mother, she told them that she had a high-tech cell phone and likely some cash inside her wallet. Officers confronted Noura about known recent arguments between herself and her mother, but she insisted they weren't anything outside the normal kind any teenager had with her parent. She told the police that her mom was very angry because her friend Perry had thrown a party at their house recently when they were out of town. He had been allowed entry inside the residence to take care of their dog. Officers observed that the daughter had a cut on her left hand. Noura Jackson claimed she had cut it on broken beer bottles at the festival that Friday night. She had been fully cooperative and open with detectives up to this point. When asked about the extent of the wound, she appeared standoffish, and she was not willing to take off her bandage. Blood found at the crime scene indicated that the victim's assailant may be wounded. Based on the degree of the victim's injuries, it was posited that she was unable to leave due to the severity and quantity of the stabbings, and her killer was injured in the incident, dropping some blood on the front porch when they left. When she provided her statement to police, Noura Jackson didn't appear to be intoxicated or on any drugs. She consented to a search of her mother's residence and vehicle at 7:51 a.m. and provided a saliva sample. Sergeant Justice took Noura back to her home and returned her phone, purse, and house keys. Her mother's house keys never surfaced. A gray hoodie was found dropped in the yard by another officer and handed over to Sergeant Justice. When the daughter's gray sweatshirt was examined, the officer found a folded-up napkin in the front pocket. It had some red spots that looked abnormal, so it was submitted for DNA testing. Andrew Hammock, Noura Jackson's friend, and Mark Irvin, her mother's on-again, off-again boyfriend, were also later interviewed by homicide detectives, and they both consented to buccal swabs being taken. Dr. Karen Chancellor, chief medical examiner, performed the autopsy. 39-year-old Jennifer Jackson had been stabbed approximately 50 times to the front and back, her arms and neck, and had multiple cut wounds. Her official cause of death was from multiple stab wounds. Based on the stab wounds not exceeding 6 inches, Dr. Chancellor determined that the width of the knife was somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 inches. But she couldn't determine the height of the perpetrator. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Chancellor could not determine in what order the victim's injuries were inflicted, so instead she grouped them according to their location on the body. 2 stab wounds made to the chest area passed through the right ventricle of the heart, and another through the left side. She opined that the wounds to Ms. Jackson's chest were done with the knife held at a 90-degree angle to the body. The wounds inflicted to the abdomen included the liver, aorta, and the victim's stomach. The stabbings made to the front of the right shoulder wounded her right lung. There were 7 to 8 stab wounds on her neck that were made side to side, one which went through the cricoid cartilage, which is the cartilage of the larynx. When she examined the victim's face, she noticed a sharp force injury to the forehead that reached the bone. There was another similar injury made to her cheek, but with a V-shaped end, and a cut on her chin that appeared to be made with a knife or another sharp instrument that had a serrated edge. There were also stab wounds made to Jennifer Jackson's left shoulder, both of her hands, her right arm and wrist, cuts to the back of her left hand fingers, and to her right hand palm. The wounds on her hands were indicative of defensive wounds. The majority of the stabs had been created by the use of a single-edged knife. In addition to the massive amounts of stab wounds to her body, she also had a contusion on the left side of her head, likely caused by blunt force. The wounds made to the victim's ribs were examined by a forensic anthropologist, Dr. Love, who assisted the chief medical examiner chancellor in the autopsy. Dr. Love determined that the wounds had been inflicted by a sharp-edged, non-serrated knife. Dr. Chancellor proposed that 2 knives could have been used in the attack, or a knife that had 2 sides, that is, one was sharp-edged and another serrated. She firmly believed that the wounds inflicted on the victim's neck had been done with a serrated knife. The exact weapons or weapons used in the killing were never identified. Regina Hunt was a local sandwich shop owner who attended the same church as the victim and her daughter, who were both frequent patrons of her shop. Upon hearing about Jennifer Jackson's murder, Regina Hunt drove to their house to comfort Noura. Noura immediately told Regina that she felt uncomfortable with her mother's friends who were standing across the street staring, and she wanted to leave. Regina drove the teenage girl to her sandwich shop, but when she saw her friends Perry Brasfield, Clark Schifani, and Joey McGough inside, Noura didn't want to see them. Instead, Regina drove her to the back of the shop and made her a sandwich. She then drove Noura back to her mother's house, where she pulled a bag out of her car, and then they went over to Caroline Giovanetti's house, where she took a shower. Joey McGough was also there. Noura and Joey went to the back room together, and when they returned, Regina noticed that her hair was wet, and both of them reeked like marijuana. She and Noura, along with Caroline and Brooke, left to go back to Regina Hunt's house. Noura asked Regina if they could stop at the Memorial Park Cemetery to visit the grave of her late friend, Anna Menkel. She watched as Noura sobbed at Anna's gravesite, but she had not shed a tear when Regina came to her deceased mother's house. When they arrived back at Regina's home, Noura said she wanted to throw a party, to which Regina said that wasn't a good idea. Then Noura said she wanted to go to the movies, but Regina told her they weren't going anywhere. Noura sulked and walked off to another area of the house. Later, more of Noura's friends came over to Regina's house and stayed there until around 11 p.m. Regina went through Noura's purse and found a bottle of prescription pills in the name of someone named Robert. There were 12 to 20 pills inside that had little speckles on them. When Regina later confronted her about the pills, Noura claimed she had a prescription for Lortab. Regina calls her out on being full of it and to start telling the truth. Noura confessed that she had gotten the pills from someone at her high school. When Regina asked her about what she had done that Saturday, Noura gave her 2 different stories. First, she said she was at her mother's house, but she snuck out to go party that night with her friends. The other story she said was that she had talked to her mom, who was already going to bed, so when she drove by the house and saw the lights off, she decided to not go back. When Regina pointed out that she had just told her 2 different stories, Noura became very defensive and wasn't able to tell her exactly what time she got home that night. On the morning of Tuesday, June 7th, Noura received a call from Sergeant Justice. She had contacted Noura about some of the numbers dialed on her cell phone to verify the timeline she had given for the night before her mother's murder. When asked about Taco Bell, Noura became flustered and wouldn't tell them which location she had gone to. Then out of nowhere she broke down. She sobbed and confessed to lying. According to the police, she told them she drove around smoking a bowl of marijuana. She lied because she didn't want them to think she was a bad person, so she made up going to Taco Bell. After receiving the call from the police in her presence, Noura asked Regina if she was a suspect in her mother's murder. Noura said to Regina, "I hug my mother, I touch my mother, I'm all over my mother." When Regina told Noura not to worry because the police would find her mother's killer, Noura very flatly and coldly said that they never figured out who murdered her father. Noura told her that she wanted to go shopping or tanning, but Regina refused to take her out, so she ended up calling Kathy Menkel, the mother of the girl whose gravesite she had just visited days earlier. Later that day, she picked Noura up from her residence and took her over to the hotel where her aunts Cindy and Grace were staying. Regina asked Noura about the cut on her hand, to which she replied she cut it while trying to chase her cat out of the garage. And yet the day before, when asked, she told Regina that she had cut it on a broken beer bottle at the Italian festival. Regina Hunt again called her out on having 2 different stories. Noura once again became super defensive and began talking about wanting to kill herself. 2 days passed, and Noura called Sergeant Justice inquiring about any new developments made in her mother's case. Then, Sergeant Justice never heard from her after that. When Cindy Eidson learned of her sister's murder, she asked her niece where she had been that night. Noura claimed to have been out with Chris all night, but she had told Perry she was at home because she didn't want him to know she was with Chris. Noura's other aunt, Grace France, had received a call from her niece sometime between 6 and 7 a.m. on the day of the murder. She told her that something terrible had happened to her mother. Then she talked to her neighbor, Sheila Koch, who was screaming hysterically, telling her that her sister had been stabbed to death. She flew from Atlanta to Memphis the following day and asked Noura to go to the police station with her so they could figure out what was going on. But Noura refused to go. When her Aunt Grace left the police station and offered to pick Noura up at her friend Kathy's house, she insisted on staying there another day with her friends. The next day, when she picked up her niece Noura, she noticed the oversized gray polar fleece jacket she was wearing and the flip-flops on her feet. She promptly took her to buy some clothes and tennis shoes. Noura only selected long-sleeve shirts, which didn't make sense given the hot and humid summer days in Memphis. Noura then wanted to return to her mother's house to pick up the tennis shoes she had bought her in Florida. Grace found this to be odd since the tennis shoes had blood on them and were technically part of a murder scene. After shopping, she took them back to the hotel where both herself and Noura's other Aunt Cindy were staying. They did their best to be supportive of their niece, but Noura wanted nothing to do with either one of them. She just kept begging them to let her friends come get her. She only cared about being with them. When Grace later inquired as to how Noura had hurt her hand, She said she had burnt it while cooking. It is not reported exactly what happened to land her there. Likely a suicide attempt or talks of suicidal ideation, but on June 8th, Noura Jackson ended up being placed in a hospital. On June 10th, the same day of her mother's funeral, Officer Turnmeyer took photographs of the daughter at the hospital. Noura Jackson's wounded left hand, her feet, and a full body shot were taken. Officer Turnmeyer observed that the young woman also had a small bruise on her left thigh. Noura Jackson remained at Lakeside Hospital for a month. Over her stay, Regina Hunt visited her there several times. Noura wanted Regina to contact Perry Brasfield, but she refused to do that. She told her multiple times how her aunts were keeping her money from her, that the cars were hers, the money was hers. Jennifer Jackson's brother, Eric Sherwood, had also received a vague message from his niece the day of his sister's murder. Noura said that something had happened and to call her back. He didn't have a chance to talk to Noura when he went to his sister's house after learning about her death. Eric visited his niece 2 times a week while she remained in the hospital over that month. When he would ask her if she had any idea as to who killed her mother, all Noura would do was put her head down and not say anything. Noura once again changed her story when her Uncle Eric asked about the wound on her hand. She claimed she cut it while jumping a barbed wire fence at the Italian festival. But then about a week later, he asked her the same thing, and this time she said she burned her hand on the stove. During her extended hospital stay, the homicide investigators turned up some surprising evidence. The investigation into Noura's alleged activities the night before and the morning she found her mother's dead body revealed the following. Noura had told the police that her mother had called her and told her to get back home, but when she drove by and saw the lights were off, she decided to not go inside. They located a receipt for cigarettes purchased from the BP gas station at 12:46 a.m. with Noura's signature. Noura Jackson claimed that she didn't return home until around 4 a.m., but phone records clearly showed that a call was made from the landline to Perry Brasfield between 12:30 a.m. and 1 a.m. There was also an additional call made from inside the Jackson residence to Clark Schifani at 12:59 a.m. Records showed the call lasted 5.8 seconds. There were additional calls made at 1:08 a.m. and 3:18 a.m., a text sent at 1:13 a.m., a text received at 2:11 a.m., and another sent from her phone at 3:34 a.m. A gas receipt stamped at 4:20 a.m. was also found. On June 17, 2005, investigator Heldorfer returned to the Jackson residence and peered inside the daughter's vehicle. He noticed there was a Walgreens bag in the rear trunk area of the car buried underneath some clothing. It was towed back to the crime scene tunnel for further examination. Inside the Walgreens sack were first aid supplies, including tape, hydrogen peroxide, and liquid bandages. Additional evidence collected from her vehicle included sandals, a white skirt, 2 floor mats, fluid samples, a paper towel with an unknown substance, and 3 empty skin shield packages. Video surveillance at the Walgreens store showed Noura Jackson asking for a paper towel for a cut on her hand. She had purchased these items at approximately 4:01 a.m. the morning of the homicide. During Noura Jackson's initial interview with homicide detectives, she never mentioned going to Walgreens in her detailed account of the night in question. Noura's aunts, Grace and Cindy, and her Uncle Eric rented an apartment for her after she was discharged from the hospital. She refused to live in a more affordable place because she was used to living at a certain level. They gave in to her demands and found a very nice apartment at the same complex where her uncle worked, so he helped move her in. Eric told his niece that she needed to find a job to keep herself preoccupied, to which she replied she would just sell pills or something. While moving furniture around the apartment, he noticed 3 or 4 different pills and a clear, hard plastic straw with white residue. Her mother, sisters, and brother were generously paying for all of Noura Jackson's expenses up until the day she was arrested. On September 29th, 2005, 18-year-old Noura Jackson was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. When her Aunt Cindy asked her niece again where she was the night her mother was murdered, specifically who she was with, all she said was she didn't know. She had been willing to support her niece in any way possible by getting her a defense attorney or anything else she could to help Noura. But things changed when she couldn't provide her with an alibi. Her uncle Eric also began to doubt her innocence. When his niece was arrested for murder, he returned to his sister Jennifer's house. Along with himself, the victim, and her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Mark Irvin, had keys to the house. And sometimes Jennifer would leave a spare key underneath a flower pot on the front porch. In the sunroom, inside a plastic bin, he found the victim's wallet, which included her driver's license, social security card, bank debit card, and a focal company card. When her family never received any answers from her, they stopped supporting Noura and refused to post her $500,000 bond. Noura Jackson was held in the county jail for 3.5 years before her criminal trial commenced. Shelby County Assistant District Attorney Amy Warwick was seeking a life sentence. Noura Jackson's defense attorney, Valerie Corder, believed in her client's innocence enough to take on the case pro bono. On February 9, 2009, now 22 years old, Noura Jackson would face her fate. Over the next almost 3 weeks, the jury, judge, and courtroom would listen to the entirely circumstantial case of matricide made against the young woman. The state presented a loosely threaded but compelling case that sought to illustrate how an affluent, spoiled teenage girl whose main priorities in life were partying, shopping, and sex wanted to get rid of her mother who threatened her lifestyle and, most importantly, her freedom. By killing her mother, the teenage girl would be the beneficiary of a little over $1.5 million. Cindy Eidson, Jennifer Jackson's sister, testified in the courtroom about an all-night conversation she had with her late sister and niece during Memorial Day weekend in 2005. Jennifer told Noura, who was homeschooled at the time of the events, that she would send her to boarding school or the military because she was partying too much and not taking her tests. Noura was already 18 years old and hadn't completed the 11th grade. She had attended 3 different high schools before being homeschooled. Her mother, Jennifer, was fed up with her nonsense, and she wanted her to either move out or go to boarding school. This was the same weekend where Jennifer was notified that a bunch of teenagers were partying at her house. Noura initially denied having any knowledge of it, but then confessed to knowing that Perry was going to throw a party there. Cindy Eidson spoke of how things became very cold and distant between the mother and daughter from that moment on. Jennifer Jackson would end up pursuing a restraining order against Perry Brasfield for his behavior, which only added to the rage and resentment Noura felt toward her mother. The victim's brother, Eric Sherwood, testified to an incident when he accompanied the mother and daughter when they visited his sister Cindy in Florida. During the trip, his sister told Noura that her drug test proved she had drugs in her system, but Noura continued to deny she used anything. All Jennifer said was that they would deal with it when they got back home to Memphis. When the 3 of them left Florida that Monday, his sister received a call from a client regarding the selling of a bond. Noura asked about the number of bonds she sold and how much money they were worth. Jennifer told her daughter that she's on her life insurance and 401k policies and would be very well cared for if something was to happen to her. Not long after returning from the trip to Florida, Eric had dinner with both of them at their house. They were discussing the vehicles from her father's estate. Jennifer said that any proceeds will either go to fund Noura's college education or they can be used to pay for the back child support she had been owed. Noura became angry about this, saying that those were her father's cars, so the money should go to her. Eric Sherwood also testified how only a few months before his sister was killed, his niece had admitted that she smoked marijuana. His sister had hosted a birthday party for him in late May at their home, to which Noura showed up late. When she arrived, her mother called her out, saying that her eyes looked glazed over and she looked high. She wanted Noura to take a drug test. Noura continued to deny that she used any drugs, and the party went on without any further mention of it. Rebecca Robertson was a friend of Eric Sherwood's, and she was the assistant manager at the apartment building where Noura temporarily lived. She invited her to stay with her and her daughter for 6 weeks before she could move into her own place. Toward the end of June, the police arrived in response to a complaint made against another resident. Noura was visiting Rebecca inside her office at the time and asked, "Are they here for me?" Noura appeared to be in a panic, extremely nervous and uncomfortable while they were there. Noura would only last about a month before she was evicted from the apartment complex due to noise complaints and having a pet. Sheila Koch, Josiah's mother, resided with her son and daughter-in-law that same month of the murder. One night in March of 2005, she was witness to a heated argument between the defendant and her mother after the girl's 18th birthday. She was walking her dog around 9 p.m. that evening when she overheard the two arguing in the driveway. Mrs. Koch heard the defendant say, "Just give me the fucking money." She heard her mother tell her to calm down and go back inside the house. Another time she recalled in the spring of that year when the defendant said to her mother, "Give me the money, I want the money." To which the victim replied, I will. That morning that Ms. Jackson was killed, Mrs. Koch went to her house to offer Noura some comfort. She sat with her as officers asked her about her whereabouts that morning. Mrs. Koch remembered how Noura never told them the same answer twice. Her story kept changing. The prosecution also presented several witnesses, friends, and acquaintances of the defendant, who testified to Noura Jackson's frequent use of alcohol and drugs and her resentment of her mother. There were also many suspicious and unexplained factors surrounding her behavior and timeline the night before she claimed to have discovered her mother's dead body. On June 4th, the evening before the victim's death, the defendant was wearing a yellow tank top, a white skirt, and gold sandals, as depicted in a photograph taken of the defendant and 3 of her friends at the home of Carter Kobach, and as testified to by Kirby McDonald. Later that evening, around 11 p.m. at Perry Brasfield's house, according to Kirby McDonald, the defendant was wearing the same top, but she had now changed into a dark denim skirt and black sandals. Even though none of the defendant's clothing tested positive for blood, this sudden change of clothing was perceived as bizarre and suspicious. John Eric Whitaker testified that somewhere between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., Noura had called him wanting to come hang out. She arrived at his place around 4:30 a.m. while he was leaving to drop his friend Dean off, who just lived down the street. John asked if Noura wanted to hop in and ride there with him, but she said no and that she was going to meet up with some people. Noura was only there for a couple minutes before leaving. Andrew Hammock described himself as having a friends with benefits type of relationship with the defendant. Andrew testified that he talked to Noura Jackson between 10 p.m. and midnight the night of June 4th. She wanted him to come over to meet her at her house, but he never did. Andrew then talked to Noura around 4 a.m. after she was returning from Eric's house. Again, she asked him to meet her at her home, but he never went. The last time Andrew Hammock heard from the defendant was when he received a text from her at 5 a.m. saying that she wanted to talk to him. Andrew Hammock claimed that he had stayed at his friend Schultz's house for 2 hours. Initially, Andrew Hammock told the police that he had talked to Noura Jackson between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. when she was driving back from a party. She had asked him to meet her at her house in 15 minutes, but he denied that he ever went. When he was asked whether the defendant had called him at 4:47 a.m., 5 a.m., 5:01, 5:02, 5:03, and 5:06 a.m., he replied that he couldn't recall if he talked to her each of those times and that he was likely asleep. He later said it was between 10 p.m. and midnight when Noura Jackson initially called him, asking him to come over. Andrew Hammack identified the gray New Balance shoes that Noura Jackson was wearing the morning the police arrived at the victim's house as belonging to his roommate, Garrett Perryman. Andrew wore these shoes when he was first interviewed by the police on June 7th. He stated that later on, a group of his friends brought the shoes in to police. Based on phone records collected from both the landline and the defendant's mobile phone, the prosecution proposed that the murder of her mother occurred sometime between 1:13 a.m. and 3:18 a.m. During this time, Noura Jackson hadn't called or texted anyone, and no one saw her. There was phone activity at 1:08 a.m. from inside the house to Claude Schifani, and then a text message was sent at 1:13 a.m. Her phone received texts both at 2:11 a.m. and 3:34 a.m., but no replies were received. Noura Jackson called Eric Whitaker at 3:18 a.m. The day before the murders, Sophia Cooley saw Noura at Carter Kobach's house. She witnessed the defendant take 3 Lortabs, which is a prescription combination pain medication containing hydrocodone and acetaminophen. It is a controlled substance. When Sophia learned of Miss Jackson's death, she went to comfort her friend Noura. She talked to her while she sat inside her friend Regina Hunt's car. She noticed a small Ziploc bag inside Noura's hand. It contained a large amount of Lortabs. Later, she saw Noura Jackson at Regina Hunt's house. She described her as being upset, but not very emotional at all. Before Jennifer Jackson was murdered, none of Noura's friends had noticed her having a wound on her hand, but several testified to seeing it bandaged afterwards. Her high school friend Kirby McDonald shared with the court that the night before the murder, while hanging out partying at Carter Kobach's house, some of the girls began to discuss their mothers. When Noura's mothers came up, all Noura said was, "My mom's a bitch and she needs to go to hell." But at the time, according to Kirby, it sounded like a relatively normal thing for a teenager to say who was mad at their mom. Regina Hunt, who had been a source of great comfort and support to the teenager in the early days following the murder, also testified that she had witnessed how disrespectful and rude Noura Jackson was toward her mother. Specifically, she described overhearing a nasty conversation between them at her sandwich shop. The defendant was furious at her mother, who was pursuing a restraining order against her friend, Perry Brasfield, because he had thrown a party at their house when they were in Florida. She was also very angry that she was going to start forcing her to take regular drug tests. The night before, Perry Brasfield, Noura's ex-boyfriend, got into a heated exchange with the defendant when he showed up at Carter Kobach's house with another girl. The conversation went from bad to worse when Noura slapped him in the face. Later on, around midnight, after partying with him and others at his place, Noura left saying she had to go back to her house. Shortly after, she called him. She wanted to get back together and left a voicemail stating so. And an hour later, a text saying the same thing. Perry Brasfield initially denied that Noura Jackson had called him that night asking about her purse or wallet got missing. The morning of the discovery of Jennifer Jackson's body, Perry Brasfield went to visit Noura to check on her. He said she was walking her dog and described her as being all right. When Perry inquired as to what happened to her hand, Noura said she cut it on some piece of broken glass while chasing her cat in the house. Genevieve Dix, an attorney who had been the victim's best friend since 1993, went immediately over to the Jackson residence upon hearing the devastating news. She noticed that Noura was dressed strangely, especially for the heat, in a long gray sweatshirt, denim skirt, and tennis shoes. The girl was usually impeccably put together. The teenage girl just stood there, holding the sweatshirt down around her knuckles, her arms straight at her side. Although she knew Noura smoked, when she hugged her, she didn't smell like it, and she had on no makeup, which was odd because she usually had on heavy eye makeup. A few minutes later, while she was on the phone, an officer approached her and said that Noura wanted to speak with her. The police wanted consent to search her mother's house, and she wanted to know what that meant. She asked Genevieve Dix 6 or 7 times whether or not the police could search her car. Ms. Dix stressed to Noura that she didn't practice criminal law and she had never seen a consent to search form before. She also stressed that she wasn't there to represent her. Genevieve Dix also told Noura that whether she consents or not, the police will get a search warrant and go through whatever they want. She told the court how Noura Jackson was an extremely smart and intelligent young woman who had no problem clearly communicating with her. Noura didn't hide her concern over the police searching her vehicle. When Genevieve Dix asked Noura Jackson what she was so freaked out about that they could find there, Noura said her bong. These interactions between the defendant and attorney Genevieve Dix would later become an important legal element. Noura Jackson's defense counsel did their best to cross-examine every single witness in hopes of creating reasonable doubt and have the jury question their credibility. They pointed out evidence that indicated someone else was involved in the crime, or maybe even more than one person. Mark Irvin, the victim's on-again, off-again boyfriend, was a pastor with the United Methodist Church. He testified to his dating the victim, Jennifer Jackson, from July 2001 until about a month before she was killed. Irvin said that they had differences of opinion that would lead them to breaking up every 5 months or so, but there was never any violence between the couple. Mark Irvin told the courtroom that it wasn't uncommon for Jennifer to sleep without any clothing during the peak of the summer, which is how her deceased body was found. However, when interviewed by the police, Noura Jackson had told them that her mother either slept in a big t-shirt or sometimes just her underwear. Irvin also said that they frequently golfed together, and the golf club found at the crime scene was identified as his. He claimed that it had been missing for a couple months, so it must have accidentally been placed inside Jennifer's bag the last time they went golfing. Irvin said that he moved from Memphis in 2004 and was living in Jackson in 2005. He said that about a month before the victim's death, he took her to a Memphis restaurant where they discussed their relationship. The victim came to Jackson a day or two later again to discuss their relationship, and that was the last time Irvin saw her. The last time they spoke was on June 4th, the day before Jennifer Jackson was discovered. Mark Irvin said that Jennifer wanted to take him out to dinner the next day for his birthday, but he wasn't quite in that place of getting back together. He stated that she was disappointed, but the conversation ended amicably. That Saturday night, Mark Irvin called her between 11:30 and midnight, but when he realized how late it was, he just hung up. The defense also addressed the gaping holes in the case and the sheer incompetence exhibited by the Memphis Police Department, in particular by the officers involved in the crime scene investigation. Officer Turnmeyer was the only one who documented the evidence from the crime scene, and once a hard copy was made of their collaborative report, the notes taken were then destroyed. Sergeant Heldorfer had reported that the surfaces of the sink and shower in the hall bathroom were wet. Yet none of the over 800 photographs taken documented this. All of the evidence in areas of the victim's residence had been sprayed with a chemical that investigators had never used prior to this incident. The chemical clung to biological fluid and was intended to help preserve items and sections of the crime scene to be photographed and then lifted at a later time. However, after they were processed, the analyst wasn't happy with the results, and the department elected not to use the product ever again. Agent Linda Littlejohn of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, an expert in microanalysis footprint examination, analyzed a pair of tennis shoes, 2 pairs of sandals, 3 gel lifts, and CDs that contained more than 660 photographs of the crime scene. Agent Littlejohn concluded that 9 of the impressions left at the location of the murder had a similar tread design to Noura Jackson's tennis shoes. However, she was never given any original evidence from the crime scene to evaluate, which she agreed was the best and most accurate method. When asked about one of the crime scene photographs that showed a bloodied footprint impression, she was unable to tell if there was any detail present in the impression due to its lower quality. From another photograph of a bloody imprint, she determined that although the tread design was detailed enough to be present, they were not consistent with the other shoes she analyzed. Lieutenant Mark Miller of the Memphis Police Department claimed that he never collected shoe prints from the first responders, the police, or the neighbors for elimination purposes, nor did he direct any of the crime scene officers to do so. Dr. Chancellor, who had performed the autopsy on the victim, addressed how the crime scene investigation unit had contacted her office for a blood spatter expert to examine photographs from the crime scene, but she wasn't aware if any were ever sent. Investigators never requested that anyone from her office attend the crime scene in person. Quadria Debnam, a specialist in DNA serology with the TBI, or Tennessee Bureau of Investigations, examined multiple items. These included a sexual assault kit, saliva samples, nail clippings from the deceased, a pair of New Balance tennis shoes, a gray pullover jacket, and a golf club. The sexual assault kit was negative for the presence of semen. The samples of blood from the various areas of the residence, interior, and exterior revealed the presence of the victim's DNA. The fingerprints on the kitchen glasses were identified as Cole Madison. She stated that she drank a glass of water in the house on June 4th. Fingerprints lifted from the interior glass of the kitchen door also didn't match the defendant's. When the top sheet of the victim's bed was tested for DNA, the profile indicated a mixture of genetic material. However, the primary contributor was from an unidentified female. It didn't match the defendant, and the victim couldn't be eliminated as a minor contributor. On one of the pillowcases, there was also a mixture of two DNAs, but there was no way to determine when the DNA was left there and when the two combined. Agent Debnam analyzed the white napkin that was discovered folded up inside the pocket of the defendant's gray pullover. She determined the presence of the defendant's blood. The blood-spattered tennis shoes revealed a strong DNA match to the victim. When the police searched Noura Jackson's Jeep Cherokee, no blood was found, nor was any on the white skirt that was collected. There was also no blood on the clothing she had worn that morning or the sandals left near the front door. Noura Jackson may have been dressed bizarrely, even suspiciously, but there was no blood spatter. There was, however, blood on her New Balance sneakers. Of course, this could be explained away by the fact that, by her own admission, she was wearing the shoes on the morning inside the house when she found her mom. Officer Martin Milner of the crime scene unit, an expert in fingerprint identification, examined the ridge detail in the blood on the bed's footboard, but it was too minuscule to compare. The condom wrapper also didn't yield any identifiable fingerprints. A BlackBerry box was located in the kitchen, but it also didn't match any known fingerprints. It was acknowledged during cross-examination by the defense that Noura Jackson's DNA was not located on the sheets, the pillows, the headboard or footboard, nor the light switch. Perhaps most interestingly was the fact that her DNA was not found in the fingernail scrapings. The only DNA found was that of the victim. The prosecution's case held zero forensic evidence that tied the defendant to her mother's murder. The ineffective and incompetent methods employed by the police, specifically during the investigation and evidence collected at the crime scene, couldn't be disputed. But nothing could change the effective character assassination of the defendant, especially by those who knew her best. Throughout the trial, which lasted almost 3 weeks, the state prosecutor called 45 witnesses and 376 exhibits were presented to the jury. Not one witness was called for the defense, and Noura Jackson exercised her Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. On February 21, 2009, 22-year-old Noura Jackson was found guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Based on the Tennessee Criminal Code, second-degree murder is defined as a knowing killing of another. A person acts knowingly with respect to a result of the person's conduct when the person is aware that the conduct is reasonably certain to cause the result. On March 27, 2009, Judge Christopher Kraft sentenced Noura Jackson to 20 years and was given an additional 9 months for drug possession charges. According to Judge Kraft, circumstantial evidence just drew a tight noose around her and there was no way she could get out of that. But this is only where this bizarre story begins. Upon her appeal in 2012, Noura Jackson sought 12 different claims, of which I will discuss only a few of the more interesting and relevant ones. The first was easily squashed because she claimed that her client attorney privileges were violated when Mrs. Genevieve Dix testified in court. According to Mrs. Dix, she clearly explained to both the defendant and the police officers that she was not there as an attorney, but exclusively as the victim's friend, and that in no way did she represent Noura Jackson. Secondly, she claimed violations to search and seizure based on the fact that attorney Genevieve Dix was not her representative, and in offering her legal advice, her consent to search was illegal. This was also determined to not be in violation since Noura Jackson was not intoxicated or under any kind of mental impairment at the time she willingly signed the consent to search forms. The appellant also claimed that the court erred in allowing the testimony of her substance use. Since the state's theory for the motive for the murder of her mother was profit, it was essential to illustrate how Noura Jackson had spiraled out of control and the reasons behind why her mother was testing her for drugs and threatening to send her to boarding school. It was also evidence of a lack of respect she showed her mother and the increased resentment she held for her. The court determined that the drug testimony was probative evidence to establish the motive. The same claim was applied to testimony that was given, which showed a pattern of all-around bad behavior. One claim after the other the court declared was without merit, or that there was no error made in its allowance, including hearsay testimony given by her relatives and photographs of the deceased. Now, one of the more interesting claims the appellant made was regarding a closing statement by the prosecution, which she said violated her Fifth Amendment rights. The prosecutor said, "Just tell us where you were. That's all we are asking, Noura." To which the defense immediately objected to and demanded a mistrial. However, since it was in direct reference to a statement made by her aunt, Cindy Eidson, when she had asked Noura about her whereabouts the night or early morning of her sister Jennifer's death, it was allowed. Another intriguing claim were the personal attacks made on the defendant during the state's closing statement. And I quote, "When you go back to the jury room, I want you to remember that all of this stuff, all of this was brought to you by the state of Tennessee. The good, the bad, the ugly. If we were all guilty of this conspiracy theory that the defense is accusing us of, don't you think we'd have Noura Jackson's blood on that bloody sheet? Give me a break. We don't pick and choose our crime scenes. We don't pick and choose the investigations. It is what it is, and it means nothing in this case. But ladies and gentlemen, this is the state of Tennessee, and I would like to think that we live to a higher standard. You have worked so hard, and part of what's going on in the country right now, and I would like to think in our community, that we're going to take part of it to roll up our sleeves and get to work, to not sit back and say, yeah, well, the police didn't do this and the police didn't do that, so I'm going home. That's not who we are. It's all fine and well for the defense attorneys to make fun of Mr. Payment or criticize a crime scene investigation or to whine about this, complain about that. I wish we had this. I wish we had that. Yeah, you know what we wish for? We wish daughters didn't stab their mothers 50 times. Wouldn't that be a great day in the state of Tennessee? But the sad, ugly, horrible truth is that it's happened, and we have to deal with it, and we have to look at it and open it up and roll our sleeves up and get to work. And we can't turn a blind eye because that easy fix isn't there. This is about something much bigger. Simply put, attorneys are allowed latitude in their closing statements. They're allowed to be theatrical and dramatic as much as they want. It is a court performance. And it was deemed within acceptable boundaries. The Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed her conviction and sentence, although the rationale for the decision was not unanimous amongst the panel of judges. And that is where her case sat until Noura Jackson filed a Tennessee Rule of Appellate Procedure, and it was addressed by the Tennessee Supreme Court in 2014. Among her most relevant claims was the fact that there was no forensic evidence connecting her to the crime scene. The murder bed, as the appellant described it as, contained the blood of two unidentified sources. Her blood was never found at the crime scene, nor were her fingerprints. Only the victim's blood was found on her shoes and in very minuscule spots, which was explained by her entering her mother's bedroom. None of the trace evidence implicated her involvement, and the shoe prints found in the residence didn't match hers. The prints of an unknown person were on the condom wrapper and on the blood spatter on the footboard. There was only a tiny cut on her hand, and no damage was done to her recently manicured nails. It was argued that the comment made at the beginning of the prosecutor's closing argument was improper because it violated the defendant's right to remain silent and not testify. Through the language used as specified in the appellate case, the prosecution directly encouraged the jury to see the defendant as guilty because she wouldn't say where she was at the time of her mother's murder. To the state, her not willing to testify was an admission of her guilt. The Tennessee Supreme Court declared this to be a structural constitutional error that places the integrity of the judicial process itself in jeopardy, and therefore must always require reversal. What was most damaging to the prosecution and pointing to signs of unethical behavior and misconduct was the fact that their star witness, Andrew Hammock, the only person in the trial whose testimony placed the defendant at the crime scene during the time frame she was killed, had not just one or two, but three conflicting stories, and thus alibis. On February 26, 2009, 5 days after the jury had returned its verdict of guilty, but before Noura Jackson's sentencing hearing, the prosecution filed state's notice of omitted jinx statement in relation to the testimony of Andrew Hammock and attached his third statement. The assistant DA had filed the notice in an affidavit describing the circumstances around why he had neglected to submit the third statement. He claimed that he placed a copy of the statement, which he had all intention of providing the defense counsel with at the earliest opportunity, into the flap of one of the trial notebooks, but that he never provided the lead prosecutor with a copy. The lead prosecutor was in charge of the direct examination of Andrew Hammock, but when she did so on February 19th, the assistant DA had forgotten all about his third statement. It was later learned that on June 13th, 2005, approximately 1 week after he made his first two statements to the police, Andrew Hammock had submitted a third. It was handwritten on the backside of a letter and addressed to one of his roommates. Andrew claimed now that he had met up with his 3 friends, Ian, Jaron, and Marcus, and they all went to the Paradiso, a movie theater, where they met up with Ryan Grisham. Andrew then went with Ryan and some others to a party, but left not long after because Ryan began a fight there. They all left in Andrew's truck, but Ian drove because Andrew was high on ecstasy. At 3:57 a.m., Andrew and Ian decided they wanted to go out again, this time to a strip club. However, when they stopped for some gas, they decided against it and just returned home. They decided to go out one last time to see a friend, but he wasn't home, so they just went back to their apartment and fell asleep. However, it was discovered by Noura Jackson's defense investigator that Andrew Hammock's third statement wasn't accurate. Ryan Grisham, whom he allegedly spent most of the night with, wasn't even in town that weekend. He was with his parents visiting the University of Mississippi in Oxford. This led to Andrew Hammock not having an alibi for the night in question. The main prosecutorial error was the fact that they chose not to disclose the third statement Mr. Hammock submitted to the police. When he realized he had screwed up his timeline and got the days mixed up, Andrew Hammock informed the police that he had left his phone in someone else's vehicle. This didn't add up since he testified at trial that Noura Jackson had called him and asked him to come over to her house and walk in there with her. He was the state's sole witness who could show that the defendant was at her mother's house in the time frame that she was likely murdered. Mr. Hammock also could have been perceived as an alternate suspect. The police never contacted the alibi witnesses he provided, and if they had contacted Ryan Grisham, they would have learned that he was out of state with his parents that weekend. Andrew Hammock's timeline was further placed under scrutiny since his roommates claimed that they couldn't get a hold of him the entire night of the crime. As aforementioned, Andrew Hammock's friends were the ones to bring in the pair of the gray New Balance sneakers to the police. They brought them to the station on June 12th and had informed the police that he was wearing the shoes the same weekend of the murder, and that they could not account for where he was that night. Although the police did take photos of the shoes, they never collected them as evidence or tested them. They simply returned the shoes to his friends, whom Lieutenant Miller described as being slightly incoherent, as if they had all been high. I guess this is why they didn't consider their concerns seriously enough to collect and keep the shoes as evidence? The Supreme Court of Tennessee would declare that the constitutional errors, as discussed, were not harmless to the criminal trial of Noura Jackson. They changed the narrative of the crime and its potential players, which could have led to a different outcome in her trial. As a result, the Supreme Court of Tennessee vacated Noura Jackson's prior conviction of second-degree murder, and therefore her sentence, and it was remanded for a new trial. In 2015, a different district attorney took over Noura Jackson's case. Instead of enduring another murder trial where she still faced a strong likelihood of conviction and a long prison sentence, Noura Jackson took a plea deal. On May 20th, 2015, she submitted an Alford plea. An Alford plea allows the defendant to plead guilty while simultaneously maintaining their innocence and acknowledging the state has sufficient evidence to convict them. At the time, the Department of Corrections in Tennessee informed her that she had accrued enough time served that she could be freed the next day. Anxious to end her time in prison, Noura Jackson agreed and pled guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter, which held a sentencing range of 3 to 15 years incarceration. However, Noura Jackson soon learned that their calculations were inaccurate and she would have to remain in prison for another year. In August of 2016, after being incarcerated for 11 years, Noura Jackson was released. Since her family no longer supported her in any capacity, she ended up living with a family friend named Ansley Larson once she was freed. While in prison, she earned her GED and was applying to colleges. She also settled with her aunts for a portion of her mother's estate. In March of 2017, former Shelby County District Attorney Amy Warwick now faced ethical violation charges stemming from the withholding of exculpatory evidence. Exculpatory evidence is evidence that the prosecution fails to provide the defense with that could potentially benefit them and lead to doubts of guilt. When interviewed by 2020 regarding Noura Jackson, Amy Warwick said she killed her mother and did her time for it. Charges against her were later dropped when she agreed to accept a private reprimand and admitted a prosecutorial error had been made. This case and Noura Jackson has been almost exclusively discussed within the framework of a wrongful conviction. But just because there was prosecutorial misconduct in her criminal trial, which ultimately led to her conviction being overturned and thus her being released, does not equate to innocence. Not everyone believes Noura Jackson is a victim of wrongful conviction. Judge Chris Kraft of Shelby County Criminal Court has zero doubt that she murdered her mother, but he thinks there was more than one killer. Judge Kraft thinks that her motivation was just what the prosecution presented. Noura Jackson was out of control, and she wanted to continue partying and not doing anything with her life except just that, and spent her mother's money. Her mother threatened that lifestyle, and Noura Jackson decided that wasn't going to happen. I wanted to discuss this case for two primary reasons. First of all, in light of the tragic Reiner family murders, it is more relevant and more important than ever before to talk about parricide. Parricide is the murder of one or both parents. Patricide is the intentional killing of one's father. Matricide is the intentional murder of one's mother. Both are extremely rare homicidal events, accounting for less than 2% of all murders. When a daughter is the perpetrator, it's even more unusual, comprising less than 1% of all reported homicides. Females under the age of 18 years old are the rarest of offenders, and with the hypothetical perpetrator in this incident just being 18 at the time of the act, her typology lies somewhere in between. I have discussed this type of murder before, so I won't go into extensive repetitive details. If you haven't listened to Parricide in Paradise or episode 49, Candace and the Chainsaw, please do so, because they are both fascinating cases that look at the issue closely. In Parricide, there are three primary sources of motivation and thus typology of offenders. Matricide committed by females is an understudied area of criminology and psychology. Most of the research is focused on male offenders, who commit approximately 85% of all parricide killings. The first type of parricide offender is known as the severely abused child. This is an individual who has long suffered physical, sexual, psychological, or a combination of abuse and neglect at the hands of one or both of their parents. In their desire to end the pain and abuse, often out of fear and desperation, they commit murder. This offender is most frequently a child or a juvenile. The second is the most common type, which is the severely mentally ill offender. This type of offender sometimes has been officially diagnosed with a mental illness, usually schizophrenia or some other kind of delusional disorder, and sometimes they are not. Either way, it tends to be a long-standing mental health condition. The violence is triggered by a mental health episode that is often directly associated with an absence of medication or a change in their ongoing treatment. This perpetrator is usually an adult child. The third is known as the antisocial type of offender. This is the kind of killer who seeks to get rid of their parents for personal gain. They are motivated by money, freedom, often both, so they can have full reign and power over their life. They are tired of their parents telling them what to do and getting in their way of what they want. For offenders under the age of 18, studies have shown that mental illness is the least likely motivation. The most common type of female matricide offenders is a juvenile who has been suffering abuse for years. Records indicate this type accounts for more than half of all known cases of matricide. The second most common is the dangerously antisocial offender. Research shows that the complex dynamic between mothers and daughters is a strong factor in the crime. There is often a power struggle, and to achieve full independence, the daughter commits the ultimate act of rebellion and violence. These murders are noted to be particularly brutal and characterized by overkill. Of the cases of Professor Hyde, the woman behind the establishment of such offender typologies, she has pointed out that one of the most disturbing elements of female-perpetuated matricide is the strong bond that exists between mother and daughter, and that most of the offenders genuinely loved their mother. In the case of Noura Jackson, if one is to believe that she orchestrated her mother's murder, whether she held the knife alone or not, she fits within the dangerous antisocial offender. There is sufficient evidence that points to her wanting to get rid of her mother's control over her life. Noura Jackson could have cared less about finishing high school and only cared about partying with her friends. She openly talked and fought with her mother about wanting her father's estate money, specifically from his vehicles, which she believed she was owed. Then when her mother is murdered, she expressed little to no emotion or concern about finding her mother's killer. Her priority, again, was to party and to live like a rich girl. She wanted to have her mother's money. She talked negatively about how her aunts were keeping her money from her, even though they did everything they could to support her, both financially and emotionally. Nora Jackson's stories and timelines were always shifting. They were never cemented, and she refused to cooperate with investigators. Again, she had no investment in finding the person or persons who killed her mother. The other main reason why I selected this case was for the sheer reason that just because someone is released from prison due to their conviction being overturned does not mean that justice wasn't in the process of being served. There seems to be some confusion around her case and what a wrongful conviction means versus a harmful error made in the trial, such as incompetent counsel or prosecutorial misconduct in her case. I have spoken about before how incredibly rare it is for appeals to be successful, and very few result in the offender being released from prison. However, there have been several cases throughout the decades of convicted rapists, child molesters, and murderers being freed from prison due to errors made that may have led to a different outcome in their case. Many people in society don't seem to grasp how expensive it is to hold a criminal trial, in particular a murder trial. Each one cuts into the resources and time of the state, and there are circumstances in which pursuing a conviction in another trial is simply not worth the time and effort of the prosecution. That doesn't mean the offender is innocent. There is not one piece of evidence that acquitted Noura Jackson of murder. She wasn't declared as innocent, and neither the judge or the prosecutor believe she was framed. There is no evidence to imply that she was framed by the police or the prosecution. There was gross incompetence on the part of law enforcement and unethical behavior on the part of the prosecution. These are the only reasons as to why she was released after serving 11 years in prison. Her case, and similar ones to it, are really important to share and discuss, so society understands how critical it is that everyone involved in the justice system does their job to the best of their ability, and that integrity is never jeopardized. These errors that can be made are detrimental to the course of justice, and they interfere with an offender paying for their crimes, and therefore the victim and their loved ones receiving justice. There is no justice in someone being free because a defense attorney, law enforcement officer, or a prosecutor didn't fulfill their expected role and responsibility. In 2022, Noura Jackson became entangled with the criminal justice system again. She was arrested for drug possession in the town of Cadiz, Kentucky. While officers were at a Cracker Barrel to investigate a report of a suspicious person in the area, they saw her removing items from her vehicle. Inside her car, police found marijuana, cocaine, and prescription medication. She openly admitted to the illegal substances being hers and was arrested. The Innocence Project is currently working on Noura Jackson's case to use updated testing to determine whose DNA was collected from the crime scene. It will be interesting to see if any significant results ever surface. I personally don't believe anything will come of the minute DNA that was recovered, if it ever was properly preserved. It is alarming and eerily coincidental how more than a little over a year earlier, Noura Jackson's estranged father, Nazmi Hassania, was shot and killed in an alleged robbery at his convenience store, Noura's Quick Stop. He was also the owner of a limousine company. That's why his vehicles had become the primary source of his estate. This became a source of contention and fierce resentment between the mother and daughter. Noura Jackson felt she was owed whatever her parents had. She believed her father's money and property, most of which included vehicles, which she and her mother both drove, belonged to her, and her alone. Noura's mother, Jennifer Jackson, was a very successful investment banker and bond trader, of which Noura was the sole heir. After her mother died, she conveyed the same notion, the same priority to take control and have complete ownership over her mother's estate. It is difficult to ignore these dark, almost too impossible to merely be coincidences that led to both of her parents' brutal and unsolved deaths. Had she hired her friends or their acquaintances to stage not just her father's murder, but her mother's as well? Possibly in exchange for a piece of her inheritance? Could it really be a coincidence that both of her parents were mysteriously and savagely murdered within only a year of one another, and her main priority after both was how their deaths could benefit her life? Could one young woman be almost cursed to lose both of her parents to violent deaths, of which never have been solved? Her orchestration of both of their murders is something that must be considered. Noura Jackson denies being involved in either of their murders and still declares that she was a victim of conspiracy. Whether she held the knife that ended the life of her mother alone, I am not so sure, especially given the highly suspicious circumstances and behavior of Andrew Hammock's statements and whereabouts. There are also many lingering questions surrounding the mysterious 2 strands of blonde hair. According to investigators, they were unidentified, but what exactly does that entail? DNA, unless the root is attached to the hair follicle, is not present in hair, and hair forensics in general is often an inaccurate and misleading science. I have read that some people suspected Jennifer Jackson's sisters, since they were both blonde and ended up being in charge of her estate, which would have been otherwise left to Noura Jackson. But this theory doesn't make any sense, nor could it have been executed in that way. First of all, her sister Grace lived in Atlanta and immediately went to talk to police on her own accord when she arrived in Memphis the following day. Her other sister, Cindy, lived in Florida, so again, the scenario that the sisters killed Jennifer Jackson is illogical. I also would presume that even the Memphis police were thorough enough in vetting their alibis. This is why it's so dangerous when individuals make presumptions or spread conspiracies around a case when they don't have all of the details around it. If I had been an investigator on this case, I would have looked more closely at the hair of Noura's girlfriends, or possibly even boyfriends, who had longer blonde hair. There was also the fact that no DNA or fingerprints belonging to the defendant were found at the crime scene. 2 things stand out to me about this. First of all, DNA is only present at approximately 20% of all crime scenes, so that alone can't be a deciding factor of innocence versus guilt. Secondly, isn't it strange and thus suspicious in itself that the victim's daughter, who lived in the same residence, didn't have her fingerprints or DNA anywhere? That doesn't make any sense. How is it possible that she didn't leave even trace DNA on things she touched in areas she lived in almost every day? I know there are many listeners who will disagree with me. You may think I am being judgmental of her behavior, which is not the case, or that she was somehow framed by the police. However, there is zero evidence of Noura Jackson being set up to take the blame for her mother's murder. The police, in particular the crime scene investigators, were so incompetent, it would be almost laughable if it weren't so troubling. The prosecutor, in particular the assistant district attorney, acted in an undeniably unethical and deplorable fashion. But that doesn't change the facts of the case. I was on the fence too until I read more than 130 pages of the court case files. Now, I have little doubt that Noura Jackson was not just a troubled, misunderstood, poor little rich girl who was unfairly painted as a party girl by the prosecution who wanted to get rid of her mother. She was a young woman who viciously slashed to death her own mother because she wanted her money and freedom, who is now free from prison. Please let me know your thoughts on this strange and mysterious case. Participate in the poll, leave comments, or feel free to reach out to me directly. If you enjoy the show, please help our global community grow by following, rating on Spotify or Apple, and leave a review on Apple or Amazon Music. I appreciate your support, more than you know. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.